Officer down! I repeat, officer down!
Welcome back to 1033. This is your host, Nathan Kapler. In last week's episode, we talked about the power of story and how I got to a point where I recognized that I needed to start telling my own story. For many of us that face this hardship in post-traumatic stress from the job that we do as first responders, we often at times begin to shut down and stop telling our story. And when we do that, we stop actually connecting with ourselves and being engaged with who we are and acknowledging what is going on in our lives. If we cannot acknowledge the pain that we are dealing with as a result of some of the traumatic things that we have seen during our service, I don't believe or have any hope that we can face these struggles that make up PTSD. If you are struggling to tell your story, that is entirely okay. I do not have expectation over you, wanting you and forcing you to tell your story if you are not ready. It may take some time. I can guarantee you that when you begin to tell your story and embrace the authentic self, recognize your pain and be able to share it with others, you will most likely be met by compassionate people who will help you heal. The podcast itself is continuing to receive, and I'm continuing to get messages daily, inundating me with support and compassion. I'm being reached out to by many people, first responders, partners of first responders, many people who are recognizing that either they themselves are not doing well or someone close to them is recognizing the signs of PTSD. It breaks my heart to know that so many of us out there are still suffering. Some of us are unaware of how to cope with post-traumatic stress. I am also filled with hope knowing that I am right where I need to be telling my story to help others. Again, I wanted to take this moment to appreciate each and every single one of you that have reached out over this last week, supporting me in what I am doing. I continue to be filled with gratitude and thanks for the feedback that I get. So in advance, I do thank you for being here and I do thank you for listening. At the end of my last podcast, I talked about how I was going to talk about trauma and where trauma sits in the body. And I actually don't believe that my timing on this is entirely perfect in the sense that I don't think I'm going to go there next. I think I'm going to put that off for a bit. You see, I've received a few comments about people actually want to hear about my story, where it started with policing, and what it looks like. So this week, I'm actually going to shift gears and I'm going to talk about my story. And I'm going to let you know how it started. In 1985, I was born in a small town called Whitecourt, Alberta. It was up in northern Alberta, maybe an hour and a half north of Edmonton, Alberta. My mother and father would welcome me into the world openly on April 10th, 1985. My sole sibling that came after me was born in 1989. Now, no one in my family had served as a police officer at that point, or from my immediate past that I can recall of. Most had come from a oil and gas background and had worked in the northern Alberta area for many years, most actually for most of their careers. I knew from an early age on that that was not going to be my goal in life. I think for me, growing up in a small town gave me an opportunity to see Mounties interact with people in such a unique way. And as a young boy, I saw that happen many, many times over. I saw police officers have these compassionate hearts and interact with people of the community in such a caring and fond way. And I was truly inspired by the compassion that they held for treating others compassionately, with dignity, caring for them, and helping them in any way possible. As we get older, we start to realize that most of our careers, most of our jobs have to do with serving others in some capacity. I think policing, though, for me, let me look at it in a platform in such a way that I could truly care for others and hopefully help those less privileged people out there that may be suffering or in need of actual help. I also saw the value of community being in a small town and the connection that is intertwined in with all of the community members. And I knew too that I wanted to give back to my community in some way. For me, policing seemed to be a very natural fit for what I wanted to do with my life. Reflecting back on my past too, I realized that naturally I believe I was probably somewhat of an optimist in every situation in my life, always seeking out the positive things that were around me. And I am also willing to admit that this may have been one of my downfalls when I was looking at policing in those younger years. I may have also been slightly disillusioned with the fact that policing was much more than just caring for others. There was a very dark side to policing too that I didn't see from my role as a child growing up in a small community. Despite not being able to see that, I truly believed that that was where I needed to take my life. And from a very early age, I started to make the sacrifices and ask people around me what I needed to do to become a police officer. Maintaining a high moral compass through my younger years and always trying to implore this idea that I always had to do what was right when no one was looking was usually one of the first things in my mindset as I continued to grow as a small boy into a teenager and then eventually an adult. My focus was also the friends that I kept. I knew that I would be defined by the friends that I had kept and some of the choices that they made. So if there were choices being made around me that I didn't agree with or didn't agree with where it could take me in my life, in my goals, there were some sacrifices that did need to be made, unfortunately. Now, I don't speak about this in a negative way. This is actually a positive thing. But I am trying to paint a picture of the realities of the fact that to become a police officer doesn't just happen one day. I believe for many of us, it's a lifelong goal. It's a way of living that starts from many, many years back. And the sacrifices to get there at times can be significant. As I grew, I recognized the fact that being a police officer was going to be a physically demanding job, and I began working out at a very early age. Being physically fit to achieve my goal was something that was extremely important to me, and it was something that received a lot of time and attention. At points, I was heavily involved in sports. I played baseball, football, swam. I did as much as I could to stay fit, and at the same time started to recognize the benefit of being involved in sports and playing on teams and being in that environment. I believe I was around 16 years old when I was at high school, and we had a career day. One of the booths that were set up was a local constable with a big RCMP placard behind him. I can remember walking up to him completely nervous, shaking, sweating profusely, probably barely to choke out a hello. But I did walk up to him and I did introduce myself and I said, "Hey, I'd like to hear more." I was filled with so much emotion that I actually do not recall much of the interaction, but the constable was kind enough to take my name and number down and said, "You know what, give it some time, but I'm going to reach out to you soon and we're going to go for a ride along so you can see what it is that we do." A year later, he reached out and said it's time, and I jumped at the opportunity to go for a ride along with him. That was at a time when ride-alongs were still allowed to happen. I don't believe they're allowed to happen anymore. So I'm actually truly grateful that at that time they were allowed because I spent a few shifts with him through the night working with him. And what I saw was something that lit a fire within me that I knew this was what I wanted to do with my life and that my goal of what I had been working towards was completely solidified. After those first initial ride-alongs, I knew I had to further my education as well. I applied to Grant MacEwan College when I was 18, I believe, but I wasn't accepted until the following year when I was 19. At the time, they offered a police studies diploma program that was about 2 years long that offered exactly what you needed in order to apply for policing and to be successful. It was the program that I knew that I needed in order to continue to build the foundation for the goal that I was pursuing. I continued to do the ride-alongs for quite some time until I was ready to go off to college, and through doing the ride-alongs, I got to meet most of the gentlemen and women that were involved in our town as police officers. There were many nights that I had a chance to sit down and have dinner with many of the men and women that served their communities. And again, I was reminded of the fact of the level of compassion that these men and women have while serving their communities. I was always fascinated with the care and the respect that they held while doing this job. But it was around this time that I started to recognize that police officers, not everybody liked them. At the time, I didn't understand why. When I was 19, I went off to college, and it was probably one of the more exciting chapters in my life. I had finally moved out of home and went to Edmonton, far enough away from my family that I felt like I was finally alone and had some kind of independence, and that I was truly forging my own journey. My cooking skills were atrocious. I ate tuna and pasta for the first year, but that did not stop me in my pursuit of continuing to further myself. While in college from 2004 to 2006, I met many wonderful people who later went on to do all different sorts of things with their lives. It was a truly unique program for that. We had 30 individuals that went through 2 years of college, and we did exactly the same courses as each other. We all became actually very close-knit. It was during my college years, though, where I learned about the potential sinister side of policing. The true impact that can be felt in a community when something goes wrong. It was on March 3rd, 2005, where 4 Mounties were gunned down on a farm by James Roscoe. Maythorpe was a town 20 minutes away from Whitecourt. And during my younger years, while I did my ride-alongs, I broke bread with these men. I got to know them. I know who they were, how kind and caring that they were, and how selflessly they served. I remember being in college broken by the news. I believe it was news that shook the entire country. Anthony Gordon, Leo Johnston, Brock Myrall, and Peter Sheeman were all gunned down while serving warrants at a farm. And they were gunned down by James Roscoe. The pain and the grief that I felt that day was unbearable. It was the first day that I truly saw the devastating impact that policing may have, and that police officers are killed in the line of duty. Regardless of my own emotions, the own struggles I felt from their deaths, I knew I wasn't going to stop in my pursuit. If anything, you could say the fire that was within grew. And I wanted more than ever to join the Mounties and serve my community. Later that year, I applied to the RCMP. At that time, I knew that the waiting period or the interview process was long. It was going to take about a year for me to see it through. So over the course of the next 2005-2006, I slowly plucked away and jumped through the hoops that were thrown before me by the Mounties to get things done. A lengthy application package was filled out first. There must have been 50 pages in this booklet, and I had to answer every single question. They knew exactly what was in my closet and how deep my past went. They knew every single person that I was ever associated to, every address that I had ever lived at, every person I had ever spoken to. Following that, I was met with an interview, which was complex at its own, physical testing, and at the time it was known as the PAIR exam, psychological testing as well, general health exams, a polygraph exam, and all while this was happening, background checks were happening. At the end of 2006, closer to November, I finally received a phone call though. And the person on the other end congratulated me for being accepted into depot and into the RCMP. And it was a quick conversation and they said, "Pack your bags, we need you here now." I was filled with excitement and pride and so honored to have been selected. Because in that moment, I had achieved my biggest goal that I had been working towards for decades. And I know many of us listening can resonate with that feeling that we got on that day. It was one like no other. During that phone call, it was decided that on January 7th, 2007, I would go to Regina, Saskatchewan to attend depot. Despite not being able to have an income during that time, because back then they didn't pay you, I knew this was exactly what I needed to do with my life. Despite the amount of excitement that I had, knowing that I would be going to depot in January of 2007, I also held an incredible amount of apprehension as well. There were a few relationships that I had fostered right around that time that I knew were going to be impacted, but I remained hopeful that things were going to be okay, things were going to work out. And that was the natural optimistic side of me, that I remained hopeful in most events, thinking that things would work out. But again, this also plays into the sacrifices that we have to make as Mounties as we continue to go through this journey of becoming a Mountie and then eventually serving your community. Losing relationships with people can be incredibly painful. But most of us are so steadfast in our beliefs that we will continue to push forward and push through that pain, no matter the cost. Now, my journey into depot and during depot warrants its own episode. So I'm actually going to stop here for now. I look forward to you joining me next week as we continue to talk about my story going into depot in the 6 months of all of the things that happened while I was there. Thank you as always for tuning into my story. I'm truly honored to share this time with you. And I look forward to continuing this conversation next week. Much love.